From Robespierre to Leon Trotsky, history repeatedly demonstrates that revolutions devour their own children, albeit in different ways and for different reasons, to significantly contrasting figures. Despite the constant patriotic thrum that recounts the Olympian deeds of the American founding fathers who signed the Declaration of Independence, they too were no exception to this rule. Some who signed that most radical of declarations did survive the struggle, later achieving great prominence in their soon-to-be newly found nation. Numerous more, however, now nearly forgotten in popular historical memory, in some cases sacrificed no less than their lives, fortunes, loved ones, and sacred honor for the liberty they sought by war's end. The following names are only 13 of the 56 total signatories to the Declaration of Independence who gave all, and sometimes more, when their John Hancock inked that seditious parchment, an act both serving as a first step to freeing themselves from the British yoke and simultaneously marking themselves as traitors against the crown. In this video, we look at the palpable human cost endured by some of those 56 figures that stepped forward and chose to publicly join the colonial insurrection against the 18th century global superpower. As always, we endeavor to evaluate figures and events within the historical context they occurred. As a case study in the timeless realities of revolution, we examine firsthand the undeniably harsh and unforgiving consequences of the American Revolution for some of those leading it that are now seemingly absent in history.
Benjamin Harrison V.
Benjamin Harrison V, a planter by profession, was a member of both Virginia's House of Burgesses and delegate to the Continental Congress from 1774 to 1777, and later as the 5th governor from Virginia from 1781 to 1784. History must think one traitor deserves another, because in January 1781, Harrison's Virginian home was destroyed by forces under command of none other than the infamous Benedict Arnold.
Abraham Clark.
Initially trained as a surveyor, Abraham Clark transitioned to becoming a lawyer by reading the law while still working as a surveyor. Once he went into practice, Clark was well known for defending cases for the poor who otherwise could not afford a proper legal advocate. Of the 10 children Abraham Clark had with his wife, 2 sons serving in the Continental Army were captured by the British and systematically tortured. One son, a captain in the Continental Army, was placed on board the infamous British prison ship the HMS Jersey. The Jersey was well known for keeping between 1,000 and 1,200 prisoners captive at any given time, quickly developing a reputation as hell on earth. Captain Clark was thrown into the proverbial hole, was fed to a point nearing outright starvation, and only so much famously as, quote, as fit through his cell's keyhole, end quote. The British sought to coerce the senior Clark by offering his son's release, but only if Clark would publicly reject his well-established conviction for the cause of achieving colonial independence from Great Britain.
James Wilson.
James Wilson is one of the most outstanding American fathers that few are familiar with. He not only signed the Declaration, but was also highly influential in the creation of the United States Constitution. Moreover, President George Washington appointed Wilson as a justice on the first bench of the US Supreme Court. Wilson, after signing the Declaration of Independence, successfully defended 23 residents of Philadelphia from forced exile and property seizure following British withdrawal from the city. Not long after, however, a drunken riot of Philadelphia radicals besieged Wilson's home, where he and 35 compatriots barricaded themselves, dubbing their stronghold Fort Wilson. Local Continental Army units broke up the riot, extricating Wilson and company.
John Witherspoon.
The Witherspoons emigrated to the colony of New Jersey in 1768 by invitation for Witherspoon to become the 6th president of Princeton. Witherspoon successfully overhauled the floundering college to the point of legitimately measuring up to Harvard or Yale. Familiar with the Crown's history of oppression in his native Scotland, Witherspoon joined the revolutionary cause with gusto. John Witherspoon saw election to the Continental Congress, serving as its chaplain. These political plaudits and aspirations for colonial independence came with a heavy price to the Witherspoon family, however. John Witherspoon lost his son, who served as an officer in the ranks of the Continental Army, perishing in combat during the Battle of Germantown, Pennsylvania in 1777.
John Hart.
John Hart was effectively a career politician for over 25 years prior to the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Hart inhabited roles that encompassed serving as the delegate of both the First and Second Continental Congresses. As Speaker of the New Jersey Assembly, Hart hid in the Sauerland Mountains for a time when the British Army advanced as far as into New Jersey as Hunterdon County. Meanwhile, Hessian troops attacked and pillaged Hart's farm.
Francis Lewis.
For Francis Lewis, hardships preceded his later revolutionary activities. It is speculated they may have inspired Lewis's turning to politics in the first place. Born in Wales and educated in Scotland, Lewis emigrated to New York in 1734. Despite his tenure as a British mercantile agent, Lewis was captured and imprisoned in France. Upon his release and return to New York, Lewis immediately endeavored to enter colonial politics, beginning as a delegate to the Stamp Act Congress of 1765. After adding his signature to the Declaration of Independence, his home in Queens, New York was later destroyed by the British. His wife Elizabeth was also taken into British custody and summarily imprisoned. Elizabeth endured apparently appalling treatment during her detention. Her torture included starvation and apparently humiliation, rejecting her a change of clothes. Mrs. Lewis's experiences in British captivity were so detrimental to her overall health that many concluded it was the primary factor leading to her passing in 1779.
Richard Stockton.
Richard Stockton was a trustee of the nascent Princeton College and was a crucial influence in Rev. Witherspoon's decision to accept the presidency of the college. Prior to the Declaration of Independence, Stockton spent time abroad, most noticeably in England, trying to change minds to support the colony's cause for independence. When that didn't work, Stockton returned to New Jersey and active rebellion. Not long after signing, Stockton was captured, beaten, and turned over to the British by loyalists while staying at a house of a friend. When he refused an offer of freedom by the British requiring pledge and amenability to the crown, Stockton was placed in the irons at Perth Amboy and tortured. Stockton's captors next moved him to Provost Prison, New York, starving and exposing him to extreme winter weather. After 5 weeks, he was released on parole. Following the intervention of General George Washington, Stockton's health never recovered. What's more, Stockton's estate in New Jersey, Malvern, was occupied by General Charles Cornwallis. The British stripped all the property's resources and finery upon decamping. However, not before, with distinct malice, burning the Malvern Library. The Malvern Library was among the most acclaimed in all the colonies.
William Hooper.
William Hooper, an eminent attorney hailing from South Carolina, was a latecomer to the cause of colonial independence from Great Britain. Considered originally a colonial loyalist due to his past dealings with the British colonial authorities, Hooper eventually managed to persuade gainsayers that were originally unconvinced of his support for colonial independence in the Continental Congress. This was no small feat. Hooper's loyalist past was not forgotten by his former friends, however. The British exerted distinct effort to apprehend Hooper throughout the conflict. When the British captured Wilmington, Hooper was subsequently separated from his family. Despite managing not to fall into British hands, incoming troops destroyed his estates in Finian and Wilmington, North Carolina. After a full year of separation, Hooper finally reconnected with his family. He survived his year-long odyssey due to the generosity of friends and neighbors. When once again together with his family, Hooper began the arduous task of rebuilding his life and legal career.
Philip Livingston.
Philip Livingston was a wealthy businessman, amassing his fortune via trade in the British West Indies. Livingston used his personal wealth for organizing the first New York Public Library in 1754. Furthermore, Livingston was a major proponent for founding King's College, now Columbia College, the oldest undergraduate school of Columbia University in New York City. He also founded New York's first Chamber of Commerce in 1770. Livingston, despite his business ties with the British, was a delegate at the pre-revolution Stamp Act Congress, assembled in protest to the highly unpopular Stamp Act passed by the British Parliament in 1765. Livingston's personal involvement in the Stamp Act Congress was his initial act of formal protest against the Crown, an act of rebellion growing eventually to his signing of the Declaration of Independence. As thanks to his earlier work for the Crown, Livingston had his home in Kingston, New York used as a British barracks, while his residency in Brooklyn Heights was utilized as a British Army hospital.
Thomas Hayward, Jr.
A South Carolina native, Thomas Hayward traveled abroad to England to receive his training in the law and to pass the bar. Hayward, upon his return, was elected to the Continental Congress for South Carolina and signed the Declaration. Following a brief time as a judge, Hayward took up arms to lead a militia force but was ultimately taken prisoner by the British at the Siege of Charleston.
Edward Rutledge.
Edward Rutledge, like his older brothers John and Hugh, studied the law in Britain, successfully passing the bar in England before returning to his home of Charleston, South Carolina, where he was a practicing attorney. Rutledge served along with his brother John as a representative of South Carolina at the Continental Congress. Edward Rutledge, at 26, was the youngest signatory of the Declaration of Independence. Rutledge's youth did not spare him serious repercussions for his act of rebellion against the crown. Rutledge was captured by the British at the Siege of Charleston. Edward Rutledge spent over a year in British captivity, eventually being released as part of a prisoner exchange.
Lyman Hall.
Originally from Connecticut, Lyman Hall migrated first to South Carolina and then to Georgia after exchanging the pulpit for a doctor's bag. The town in which Hall settled, Sunbury, sent him as their delegate to the Second Continental Congress, as Georgia had not been represented in the first. As such, Hall signed the Declaration, and interestingly enough was apparently one of 3 physicians to do so. For Hall and his town's trouble to get Georgia included in the famous delegation, Sunbury, located in St. John's Parish, fell victim to conflagration initiated by British troops, forcing Hall and his family to flee north until the Revolution's end.
Arthur Middleton.
Arthur Middleton was Cambridge educated, travelling widely in Europe before participating in any revolutionary function. Middleton was voted to succeed his father as delegate in the Continental Congress, thereby eventually becoming a signatory of the Declaration. Following the start of the war, Middleton served in the defense of Charleston, South Carolina. There he was subsequently captured by the British in 1780 at the Siege of Charleston. Middleton was sent as a prisoner to St. Augustine's, Florida, joining the aforementioned Edward Rutledge and Thomas Hayward Jr. Middleton was released by prisoner exchange the next year.
The Declaration of Independence and the Realities of Revolution.
In this week, where each American takes to the best of summer, we also reflect on the deeds of those figures that gambled everything to achieve a better form of governance. We hear a great deal about Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, and Franklin. However, it must never be forgotten that fate and history were far better to these men than many of their compatriots. While the price was high for many of these revolutionaries, they managed to remarkably hang together throughout this struggle. For if they had not, they most definitely would have hung separately. May we never find our gratitude lost to posterity. Or something like that, I suppose, if you're American.
Be sure to follow and subscribe for upcoming AD History podcast episodes, available wherever podcasts are found.